Ocular by Iniquity. Chapter 9. When he woke again, the cobwebs had gone from his mind. Had that happened? Not only had he been so bold and somehow so stupid and so forward as to ask Lawrence to kiss him, but Lawrence had obliged. It seemed absurd, but it also seemed too clear in his mind to be imaginary. He could remember the taste of Lawrence's skin. He could remember the warmth of his lips. He had kissed Lawrence first, and then Lawrence had kissed him. He was sure he had felt nothing in his life like it. They could be hanged. Somehow that did not take much off the magnificent edge of the memory. They could be hanged. It must have happened. Perhaps Lawrence had only done so to oblige the wishes of a half-dead friend. He would have done almost anything if Lawrence had requested it as his dying wish, including kiss the man. But could his kiss be so soft, so warm and loving, if it had been done only out of a sense of obligation? He ran this question over in his head several times. No, it could not be. It was not possible. So many things could be faked in this world. One could be older, or seem younger, or pretend to care for a creature they despised. But he could not imagine that a man could pretend to be as Lawrence had been. He had been too gentle. No man could kiss another man with such tenderness if they did not have that tenderness to spare. That feeling could not be forged. There was only one answer, and that was that Lawrence had feelings that closely mirrored his own. He did not allow himself to consider other possibilities. This one was simply too wonderful. He took stock of his surroundings. They were still curled up together as they had been when they had kissed. The space that he had mistaken for heaven, or the storm, or some strange other half-universe, was his cot, though 5 or 6 blankets had been piled over it. That must have been the reason for the warmth and the darkness, and also why it seemed so stuffy. A greatly muted sunshine shone through. Lawrence slept soundly around him. He imagined the man was run ragged from taking care of him doing his duties, and likely Alexander's as well. He did not need to wake Lawrence to enjoy his company. What would be his strategy? He could plead ignorance. Men had said things they could not be held responsible for while in an insensible state, which he had certainly been. He could deny, but such a thing made his chest ache differently on top of his regular pains. He was not a man to deny his feelings. It was difficult for him to say one thing and mean another, but this was an extreme case. Even if he did not pronounce this thing, which he would not and could never to the universe at large, he could not pretend it did not exist. He would wait for Lawrence to act and make a decision based on that. Perhaps Lawrence would ignore that the event had happened. That option also stirred something low and uncomfortable in his stomach. But Lawrence was not some stationless mongrel from nowhere to throw away what he had for the sake of what would only seem an army dalliance to the world at large. If Lawrence wished to not acknowledge that he too carried a tarnished soul, as Alexander's must have been, he could not be forced to do so. But the kiss had been so wonderful. He could not help himself if this were to be the end of him. If Lawrence only allowed his sin because he was to shortly pass, he would take as much as he could manage. No one knew how selfish he was more than Lawrence, after all. He planted a small kiss on Lawrence's exposed throat, then realized the godsend that was the man's cravat. He would no longer be able to look at the patch of skin without thinking about what it felt like to kiss him there. Each kiss gave him a swooping, illicit thrill in his chest. Kissing Lawrence was enjoyable. Laws be damned. Laws had made him a penniless bastard orphan. Lawrence made him whole. He stole another kiss. He heard a murmur. "Hello, dear Lawrence," Alexander whispered into the man's skin. "I hope I did not wake you." "An insect is biting me on the neck," Lawrence murmured, but his voice was warm with affection. A hand squeezed Alexander's shoulder. "How do you fare?" "I feel as if a regiment has marched over me while I slept." It was not an exaggeration. The pain was different than it had been the first time, but no less in its severity. He felt as if he had just been force-marched through 2 or 3 states, and if he flagged, and he had flagged, he was beaten. When had reached whatever forced destination was requested of him, he had been thrown to the frozen ground, and then men had trod all over him in new boots, stomping his muscle aches into his bones and grinding the pain into the invisible fibers of his soul as if he were a meal to be seasoned. Where Lawrence touched him, he felt less ragged. The man's hand on his arm was like a lifeline to some mysterious past where things might have been better. And if there had been a past where he had not been so weak and pathetic, he reasoned, there must be a future. And if that future would be with Lawrence, it was worth fighting towards.
Pain is a symptom you are alive, Lawrence murmured.
I am very much alive in such a case, Alexander replied weakly. Lawrence laughed softly as he shifted to look at him. The sweat gleamed on the other man's face, and the dim lighting filtered through the blankets did him no favors. But Alexander found it could not ruin the peace he found when he caught the man's gaze. Lawrence drew a hand across his forehead to tuck a stray hair behind his ear. Alexander could sense the conversation before it happened.
Do you remember what you said to me before?
Lawrence asked. In the hazy darkness, Alexander could not read his expression. He did not know what the correct answer was. His heart clenched. Yes, he replied, because nothing seemed clearer in his mind than the man's affection. To remember was not incriminating. Hopefully Lawrence would not revile him for remembering. There was a silence. Was that to be it? Would there be no further discussion on this matter, as if it had never occurred? Would Lawrence never acknowledge that single solitary thread between them, harder than steel, left behind the debris of his illness? Was it to be an event that all would pretend had never occurred? Would Lawrence never tell him what he had thought when Alexander had, as he was wont to do, opened his mouth and said something revolutionary? He had to know. He could not sit in this indecision purgatory. It would be monstrous to be scorned, yes, but perhaps he had always been scorned. He would at least be granted the honor of knowing he was scorned. He managed a deep breath as if such a thing could give him the confidence that whiskey could, and shifted to kiss the other man. Lawrence did not pull away or recoil, and his lips were tender and gentle. The kiss stole Alexander's breath. It was not a horrible kind of not breathing, which he was rapidly becoming accustomed to, but instead something hot and tight in his chest, squeezing his sore heart. It must have been that he was ill. When they separated, Alexander found himself unable to stop smiling, despite the sharp pains all over, despite the fear of what Lawrence might say, despite the gavel seemingly looming. He remembered this feeling. This was the feeling he felt when he would receive letters from Eliza. It was the same feeling he got dancing with her. It was the same as the one he felt when they would eat dinner at the Schuyler dinner table, and he could look across the table and see her beautiful face. It reminded him of being in love. He was in love with Lawrence. The thought struck him like a musket ball to the chest, different than everything else. He sucked in a surprised gasp. The stifling air from under the blankets caught in his throat like dust, choking him into a series of rasping coughs that had Lawrence desperately looking at him and patting his back. Pain shot through him all over. "Breathe, damn you!" Lawrence hissed with poorly disguised panic. The air rattled in his lungs. He managed one breath, then a second. He would not die. Coming to a conclusion had not killed him before, and he'd be damned if it managed to this time. He was in love with Lawrence. He had long since known that he cared for the man more than anyone, and that he would have done anything for him. He certainly did not shy away from physical contact, be it a hand on his shoulder while they spoke, or settling close when they drank. But somehow the last piece of the puzzle had remained veiled to him, and now suddenly it had been exposed all at once, like a painting hidden behind a black curtain. It had been there all along. He had simply never looked at the situation from an angle that would reveal this result. He could not go back to ignorance. He was not a man to turn his back on knowledge. "It was only a spasm, my dear," he managed, gathering his breath as much as his thoughts. Lawrence made an unhappy sound and kept stroking his back. Alexander was not about to ask him to stop. Instead, he would distract the man. He drew Lawrence to him again for another kiss, this one longer. It was terribly dangerous to take such joy in something that you could suffer so much from if it was discovered.
I do not understand how something so reviled can be so marvelous, my Hamilton,
Lawrence said when they separated. Despite a tinge of uncertainty in his eyes, he wore a little smile, and it banished the fever from Alexander's bones. The warmth that spread through him upon looking at Lawrence's warm face cemented his hypothesis. I am inclined to agree. Alexander shifted so they were more comfortably settled to look at one another. But as you are explicitly ordered by the general to take care of me, one cannot reasonably and with justice hold you responsible for any actions you may take in the interest of my well-being. Lawrence laughed.
You are a scoundrel.
A scoundrel who enjoys kissing you. For his wit, he received a kiss. He burrowed into the embrace, and Lawrence wrapped his arms more firmly around him. If Alexander closed his eyes, he could pretend the war was over, and that somehow he could bring Lawrence to his home in New York, and it would be the three of them. They would go to France together, and they would come back, and him and Lawrence would build the marvelous future of their country. He opened his eyes. In the dim light under the blankets, he could see a few sad stains on Lawrence's jacket, and the slight discolor of his undershirt from going too long without a washing. They lay in a stifling doom of blankets to fight off the vicious chill, dreaming of a proper meal and a decent bed. All around them was death and suffering. He swallowed his misery and tried to ignore how much everything hurt. Instead, he focused on Lawrence. The man's strong arms wrapped around him, the even, calm sound of his breathing, his slight movements as he inhaled and exhaled. An uncharacteristic calm came over him.
Are you hungry or thirsty at all?
Lawrence asked. Both, I admit, he said, but it seemed silly to acknowledge such a thing when there was barely food to be had.
If I go to gather something for you to eat, will you run off?
My dear, I do not think I can stand.
That is not an answer to the question, and nor has that stopped you on a previous occasion.
Alexander managed a laugh with some effort. I promise to lay under these blankets until you return. Lawrence nodded at him.
I do not need to say how distraught I shall be if you disobey,
he said, frowning. Then he began to shift out of their cocoon. When he moved, a blast of cold air whipped in, raising the hairs on the back of Alexander's neck. He decided that maybe if only some of his work could be moved under these blankets, he would never go out into the cold again. He did admittedly feel bad for the men whose blankets had been repurposed to the task of warming him. This was a good opportunity to get some thinking done. He pondered over whether he could, and did, love Lawrence. He felt moderately certain that he did, but even so, this thought was not above examination. It was a strange thing to consider. Could a man love two people at once? And one another man, nonetheless? He could not think of reason why not. Although reviewing the facts at hand, it did seem to be a bit odd. But it was undeniable that Lawrence had made him feel the same way as Eliza. The feelings matched up too clearly for it to be anything else. Listening to Lawrence laugh at his jokes gave him the same warm feeling as Eliza commenting on his letters. It was not that he did not miss Eliza, but somehow it hurt less because Lawrence was there. To be in Lawrence's arms was his very small, very private version of heaven. When Lawrence spoke, he could listen better than anyone. He understood the man, even when he did not understand himself. And no one understood him better than his Lawrence, who could pluck the problems and solutions from his diatribes with ease. Lawrence had taken the full responsibility of his care. Alexander knew that this was no small thing, given with how sick he must have been. He could not imagine what it must have been like to lay with his fever-riddled body in the dark, suffocating silence. And the time. He had no idea how long he had laid there. Only something as senseless and irrational and wonderful as love could inspire a strong, healthy man with so much to do to lie with a breathing corpse. He heard the sound of the tent flaps ruffling and ignored the rumbling of his stomach. He had barely eaten anything since getting sick. Some whiskey, Lafayette stale bread. You could not imagine how bad he looked. He was already small for a soldier, and this would result in his uniform hanging off him like he was a skeleton.
Can you sit?
Lawrence asked from outside the blankets. Alexander considered this task. He reluctantly moved his hands around him and tested his arms. It would be a great effort.
Did not mind it.
There was the sound of furniture shifting towards him and papers ruffling.
Pull the blankets down to your waist.
Alexander did so. The harsh, sharp cold stung him, and a shiver raced up his spine. Even through the tent cloth, the sun was so bright that he was dazzled. The tent did not seem that much different from when they had arrived, at some mysterious point in the past. Lawrence got an arm under him and lifted him into a sitting position. Then, with a grunt, the man pulled him back and let him rest against a table leg, giving him a close approximation of sitting. Lawrence sat next to him, picked up his blankets, and draped them over his shoulders. Part of him considered complaining, but if he did in fact love Lawrence, of which he had not yet decided, his behavior ought to be tolerated in silent indignity. You should be honored, said Lafayette's voice in his head. Lawrence held the canteen to his mouth with superb care, and he drank deeply. More importantly, he was hungrier than he could remember being, ravenous even, and he very well knew that a few pieces of stale bread and water would hardly sate him. But this was war, and there was nothing he could do. Lawrence tore the bread into pieces and fed them to him slowly. Chewing was a monumental effort, but now that he had promised Lawrence not to die, he could not be stopped by such obstacles. Do you have whiskey, dearest?
Of course.
Lawrence pulled a flask from his pocket and gave Alexander a good serving. It added a familiar burn to his throat and a warmth to his stomach, and even better when Lawrence arranged for him another gulp, which he willingly took. He sat in the silence between them, watching Lawrence with half-lidded eyes. He decided to make a point to look at Lawrence more often. He was an exceptionally handsome gentleman, after all. Lawrence ate his own bread in a hurry, and Alexander studied the man's cravat, knowing the man's flesh hid beneath. He knew that skin. He could not resist a smile.
Do you need for anything?
Lawrence asked, taking another drink of whiskey. His voice had an unhidden note of concern.
Or will you be fine in this manner? Would you prefer to lay down? I can see if more food can be found, but I'm afraid it is difficult to procure a feast as of late.
Alexander made a huff of a laugh. Yes, my Lawrence, I would like a carved turkey, and some fruit, and a freshly baked loaf of bread with jam.
Lawrence laughed too. And some wine perhaps, and a block of cheese.
Such would be my regular fare as a student of King's College. He offered a weak little smile. Only since meeting Eliza had he occasionally managed a decent meal. Immigrant orphan students were not known for their overflowing purses.
Lawrence snorted. If you are as satisfied as one can be short stealing of house dinner, I find myself forced to do some work rather than lay with you. Is that acceptable?
In the interest of complete disclosure, my first preference would be for you to be with me, my dear. Nothing matched having those arms wrapped around him. Nothing matched the feeling of the other man being so close. Although it would be grossly unfair for me to keep another man from his work.
When I am finished, I will lay with you,
Lawrence told him. He nodded. That was a reasonable compromise, as Lawrence's work was not endless like his own.
Are you comfortable sitting?
Yes, it is fine, for I am not able to properly see you otherwise. The cold stung his face, but the whiskey helped, and the rest of him was covered in blankets. A little chill was more than worth being able to look at Lawrence. Lawrence moved to sit at his chair at his desk and started reviewing the monstrous stack of letters there. Occasionally, he would pick up his pen and craft a response. Unlike him, Lawrence did not have to repeat every sentence back to himself until it was perfect. Alexander watched him in comfortable silence until he could no longer keep his eyes open.